I'm feeling really guilty having these boxes full of miniatures that I'll probably never in a lifetime get to paint. But one good thing about having all of these boxes full of miniatures in your pile of shame is that you always have extra bits and parts to throw together the wildest kid bashes. And one of my favorite things in this hobby is to tap into the creativity of other people, whether it's artworks or fan art, and to get inspired and just throw together some really cool mini that doesn't already exist in this form. And it doesn't matter how many parts I need, and if I need to do some sculpting, as long as the end result is something really unique. And we'll do something similar today. So in this video, I'll probably present to you
the Batman.
Enjoying both Space Marines and vampires in the Warhammer universes, Night Lords were always a Venn diagram overlap that tickled my fancy. The natural thing to do when creating some Space Marines in vampire cosplay is to use fantasy vampire parts. But because I have a problem with destroying expensive plastic toy soldiers to create even more expensive plastic toy soldiers, I decided to make a copy of the parts that I needed. Eventually, I still want to paint my Prince de Val because it's an awesome model. So I whipped out my trusty Oyumaru and created a mold of the parts I wanted to use. When doing this, you need to make sure that the thermoplast covers properly. So I made sure to press the sides into the piece I wanted to mold in order to retain all the detail. I also pressed in part of the shoulder armor because the bat face on it would come in handy as extra armor detail. One complaint that I hear a lot when people work with these types of press molds is that they are losing detail, and that is usually due to air being trapped when you press the clay in, or the clay not reaching into all the wrinkles because you simply can't apply enough even pressure to get the material into these fine details of the mold. So before I put the bulk of my epoxy clay into the mold, I make sure to fill these small parts. Then I just fill in the rest of the mold with a little spill over the sides just to make sure that everything gets copied over. The copied parts always come out perfect when you follow these steps. So a little extra patience during this part always pays off. I'm still using Primaris Marines from the Dark Imperium box, which this body also is coming from. I was a bit unsure how much I would have to cut away from the Marine chestplate. That's why I always go slow in these scenarios. It's simply more difficult to resculpt parts that you cut away than taking a bit of extra time and going slow when planning out the result. I realized the color of the Marine would fit right into the upper area of the Val's chestplate if I made the U shape just a bit wider. And after cutting away anything that wasn't part of that skull on the main portion, it snuggled right in there. So I glued it in place and scraped away a few parts in the lower area so they would meet on the same level. Then I was looking for places to put my extra vampire elements, and the size of the shoulder armor was just about right after I cut away the extra features to fit on the knee pad of the Space Marine armor. I cut away the round part, and initially I thought I would keep the lower edge of the plate the bat face was sitting on to add an extra bit of gothic feeling. That didn't look good enough, it was just too large and didn't properly work. At that point I already cut away the line dividing the round part from the shin, so I had to resculpt that part, which was a bit of a pain. The helmet would have to be something really special. I was looking through my bits box, but I couldn't quite find a helmet with a skull face that would fit by maybe just adding some kind of bat wings. So I was looking online for printable parts, but I also couldn't find anything I liked. Honestly, if these were available as an STL file, I'd probably have bought them, but I didn't want to buy a pack of 5 where I only really liked 2 designs out of the 5 and had to pay shipping on top. At least the designs gave me a bit of a direction I wanted to go in. My very best investment ever was the Games Workshop skull box, and I picked one of these bloodletter skulls, which I thought would fit nicely. The idea was to cut away as little as possible from the helmet to fit the skull part in. As an example, I kept all the piping intact. Next I got rid of the top part of the helmet so I could do something similar to the designs from before. That would give me a more aggressive and dramatic result. So far so good, but here it got a bit tricky. The eye sockets were a bit too small to fit Space Marine lenses in, so I basically added just 0.5 millimeter of material onto the skull parts, bulking them up. This is a good exercise for learning how to sculpt, by the way. You are recreating a shape that already exists, just a bit bigger. I wanted to add sharp angles and lines to the final design, so first I had to build some additional volume. Starting with a long piece of clay in the middle of the helmet that would form an edge between left and right half. Then I added a similar part to the right and the left, where I would later carve my lines into. Again, I know this doesn't necessarily look like beginner stuff, but trust me, see it as an exercise. Just like you can learn brush control This teaches you how to use your tool and how to work with the clay while applying the thin layers. I was filling in the area in between 2 rows of clay and then carefully carved a line on the side and refined it with the color shaper. A final pass with sandpaper after everything was cured makes sure that everything is sharp, clean and even. Next I needed some wings for the helmet. There's a lot of bats in the Cursed City box, and where there's bats, there's bat wings. So just one of these swarms was pretty much setting me up for a couple of Night Lords and not just one. There's multiple sizes and I picked one that was appropriately sized for the helmet. These wings had a great structure and I just cleaned off the smallest finger and the area where the glue would go on and then attached the wing with super glue. I guess sometimes the stars just align. I just filled that small gap on the side and the helmet was done. But first, before we continue, thanks a lot to this video's sponsor, or rather sponsors, all of you who support me on Patreon. Each month I upload additional content like longer versions of the YouTube uploads, more in-depth guides and step-by-step PDFs, as well as videos on topics that patrons requested. So if you are interested in additional ways to learn more about miniature painting and supporting me at the same time, this is the way to go. Support on Patreon is what makes the YouTube videos possible. Without your support, the channel would have died years ago. So apart from these people on screen that chose to support me and the channel at the video credit supporter level or higher, let me say a special thanks to these top 10 all-time supporters. Flavia Hollyoak, Steven Sass, Louis Suleiman, Lou Fangs, Ken Chung, Jason Chatwin, Paul Seufert, Guy Estes, Hans-Rainer Peitz, Harald Schott and Seang Lim Tan. Thanks a lot to everyone that has supported me on Patreon so far for allowing me to be able to do these videos and help people on their miniature painting journey. One box that's a pretty awesome fit for the project is this Screwed box. There's all kinds of gruesome parts in there, like flesh on hooks, halves of rib cages and flayed skin with bones. I did end up not using the flesh bits, but flayed skin would fit as a loincloth.
Actually, the cloth you and many think is a loincloth is a half tabard. While a full tabard covers from shoulders down, the half is waist down.
Learn something new every day. And this would also be a good spot to fit this small bat head that I still had left over from Prince Duval's chest plate. To create some space for the bits, I got rid of the belt buckle and tried to find a good position for this part. It turned out to be a bit too wide, so I had to cut down the sides. And I'm inching my way forward here. Again, the more careful I am at this point, the less I have to resculpt later. And as you can see in the end, it fit right in there like it was meant to be. And the only thing left to sculpt was the part where the skin attached to the arm. I thought about leaving it attached to the chest plate like this, but then I decided to use the vampire belt buckle after all, like I initially planned, so I made a cut right under the belt, got rid of the part above, and carved away the more extreme folds because they didn't make sense in the context. I wanted something smoother that was just hanging. And doing it this way I could still keep the bones, even though we lost some of the skin parts. I plopped the belt buckle right on top of this and filled the surroundings up with some Milliput. In order not to make it look like just a few parts thrown together, I added skin parts wrapped over the belt and flaying out towards the sides. That way everything looks more integrated and it's just a small time investment, but this will look more natural and credible when the miniature is base coated. I had a suspicion that the arms would need a bit of fiddling around, because I had a very particular pose in mind. And I went back to my Dark Imperium box and looked for a few arms with guns and also a sword arm. Once I found a good one, I needed to chaos it up though, because they weren't just standard Space Marine arms. So I got rid of the standard pauldron and added one from the old Chaos Space Marine spruce that I found in my bits box. It ended up looking a bit too flat and boring though, so I made one more copy of Count Duval's shoulder guard, and I started to carve into the Chaos pauldron. Once I had a big enough hole, I just slapped a portion of Milliput into the gap and pressed the demon bat face on. And I made sure that the curvature was similar to the original curve of the pauldron, so I had to cut away as little as possible. That way I only had to smooth out the areas around it and sand away the little bits still standing out afterwards. I didn't film that, but you get the idea. While the material was still soft, I added some detail so the face looked like it integrated with the pauldron, almost like a demon living inside. This would be a lot of fun to paint afterwards. When everything was done, I added back some of the typical chaos patterns to the trims. And I didn't really plan this, but there was just enough empty space to fit some of the smaller wings. For the sword arm, I needed just the right pose in order to make the weapon work. I found a good one in the easy to assemble Reapers pack. Problem was that it was holding a pistol, so I took that off with a clean cut and took another sword arm from the Dark Imperium box because I needed it for the armored hand. The archaic sword that I wanted to use because it would be fitting the theme better was coming from the Nighthorn's Bladegeist Remnants box and had a bare hand holding it, so I had to replace that. I drilled holes for the pins on everything I wanted to use and swapped the swords with clean cuts. Then I did some more pinning and gluing and eventually attached the arm. I glued the hand to the arm in a particular angle, as if he was commanding his brethren to charge the enemy. After dry fitting the helmet to check if the pose would work, I filled the gap and detailed the articulated parts. For the weapon in the other hand, I made this small bayonet from an old chaos knife from my bits box. Again, this arm was a standard marine arm, so I had to add something to make it fit the chaos theme better. And speaking about that, something that Games Workshop overdoes a bit in my opinion these days is these trims. They're plastered on the Chaos Space Marines and I almost want to scrape some of them off every time I paint one because it makes them look so overloaded. Here I have to do the exact opposite and break the monotonous and clean parts of the Space Marine armor up, and I added a few of these ornaments. I pressed on the rough shapes as thin as possible and then used a combination of color shaper and scalpels to push it in shape and carve clean edges. The last details I pushed in with a needle, especially if I wanted a really sharp corner, like here for example. Whenever the surface looked too flat, I pushed in a bit of texture with the tip of my color shape to create more variety. When I do this, I usually leave the clay to harden a bit before I start working. That way the Milliput isn't as flimsy and a bit more durable and easier to work with. It's always fun to experiment a bit with drying times and to see how the properties of your putty or clay change over time. The only thing left to do at this point was also the most important thing. I had to find a backpack that was large enough to hold the wings, but at the same time would not bulk the figure up too much, since I didn't want the wings to look too small to carry the body. I tried a couple of backpacks, but the one I settled on came from the Indomitus box and belonged to one of the Eradicators. I cut away the exhausts and cleaned the sides so the wings would fit. The wings I used here were Dark Elder Scourge's wings. There's also a Daughters of Cain box that has more of these leathery wings, but they looked a bit too slender for my purpose. The base of the leathery parts was a bit too wide, so I marked the proper width that would work with the backpack with a scalpel and carved a credible curve. After I was happy with this, I did a bit of cleaning up, basically making the leathery parts a bit thinner again to be in line with the other membrane edges. Then I pinned the wings to the backpack and double checked if I was happy with the pose. I couldn't just leave it like this. I had to sell my idea that the wings grew inside and broke out of the backpack. So to blend it all together, I slapped some Milliput on the sides and pressed it flat. And then I had to come up with patterns that added to the idea I tried to convey. So I used a combination of needles and scalpels to create cracked and flaked elements of armor that were pushed aside by the wings. The backpack looked a bit too generic, so I decided to place another Nightlord symbol. I cut away the back of the head of one of the human skulls from the skull box so I could place it on the spherical feature on the backpack. Then I added a pair of small wings from the beds I still had left over. It was a quick thing to do, but I like it a lot. Then I just made sure to fill all the gaps that were left so it looked like everything was part of the sculpt. And here's the final result. I'm really happy with how it turned out and how the pose and all the individual parts work together. The gothic feeling of the sword, the wings on the helmet, and how the wings create a bit of a backdrop and frame the full figure. This is definitely something I want to paint eventually for a competition, because it's a really unique piece that will probably draw a lot of eyes. Let me know in the comments what you think, and also let me know which conversion you're interested in next. If you're curious about what it takes to get going with these type of conversions, find out all of the basics in this video, and I also have additional videos about sculpting for conversions on my Patreon. Also, don't miss out on a new great way to paint really unique Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines, and make sure to watch this video.